Well, good morning, Boker Tov. Welcome back to the Mishkan Katan weekly broadcast. I'm so glad you're here. We are continuing today to go through my recent trip to the Blessed Land, Israel. I was there in June, in early June, and it's just such a joy to get to share with you about that here on the recent broadcasts that we've been doing. And I decided I'm going to try and hurry this up a little bit. I've been doing one day of the trip each week. And I'm going to see if I can move that along a little bit because I really want to get back to studying the book of Ruth with you here. I'm about halfway through that book before I left on my trip. And I want to get back to that. We've not studied Ruth since early May, of all things. So without any further ado, I want to go ahead and start telling you about day 9 in our trip, which was in the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the focus of the second half of our trip, and our first full day in the city began with a trip to the Temple Mount. Now, I had visited Jerusalem in 2018 twice, and neither time had I been able to get to go to the Temple Mount. And it takes some maneuvering to get to go up there, I'll tell you. But fortunately, our tour guide has lots of good connections in Israel, and he is one of the foremost experts on the ancient Jewish temple in the world. His name is Joseph Good, and Joe, as we call him, has a ministry called Hatikva Ministries. If you're familiar with Hebrew at all or with Israel at all, you probably know that Hatikva means the hope, and that's actually the name of their national anthem as well, which speaks of hope. But at any rate, when we went up to the Temple Mount, Joe was pointing out all kinds of things up there, all kinds of archaeological features. He actually made a discovery up there a few years ago of an ancient washroom, an ancient set of toilets. And so he was showing us where that was. And of course, we had to be kind of careful. It was a little bit dicey because if you're not a Muslim, you have to be very careful where you put your foot on the Temple Mount, because you see, there are many restricted areas where non-Muslims are forbidden to go. The entire Temple Mount area is controlled by a group called the Waqf. Now, that's a strange sounding word, isn't it? It's pronounced it's spelled, W-A-Q-F, the Waqf. It's a Muslim agency that keeps everyone following their rules, because the Temple Mount is not only a Jewish holy site, it's a Muslim holy site as well as a Christian holy site, but it's controlled right now by the Muslims. And one of the rules, other than not stepping where you shouldn't step, is how you are dressed. And we were given a lot of instructions about how to dress modestly for that excursion to the Temple Mount. And so that day I had on a pair of very flowy pants. It was, of course, hot. And these were linen pants. They were so flowy that they almost looked like a skirt. And I think that's how I was able to be left alone as far as my dress that day when we went up to the Temple Mount. But it was interesting. Some of the people in our group were asked to put on a wraparound skirt. And some of these members of our group who were asked to do this were actually men. The men were asked to, they had on pants, or they had on shorts. Some of them had on, like, knee length shorts, and that was just deemed to be unacceptable. So they had to put on these long skirts, and of course they weren't very flattering, but that's just what was required. And to me that was a little over the top, but I wasn't in charge, right? So it didn't really matter. But the main thing was we got to go, and it was amazing, and I certainly praise God for that. Now, when you get up there on the Temple Mount, you will see um, some beautiful trees planted there around. But our guide Joe pointed out to us that there are three times in the Torah where Father God says, "You shall have no trees near my altar." So in the days of the temple, there were no trees on the Temple Mount. Jews did not plant trees there. Jews did not plant the trees that are there now, because it would be breaking a mitzvah. And so the trees that you see on the Temple Mount now, although beautiful, are they're against Torah. Okay. And so I thought that was an interesting thing. And so, of course, we saw things like the remnants of a wall that marked the area where the Sanhedrin would hold meetings. We saw it's like a thing on the top of the stone, and it would have been beneath it that the toilet area was. There was this large fountain. It looks like a fountain. I have a photo of it, and I'm going to show you my photos at the end. But this looked like a large fountain, but there was seating around the fountain, and it was a area to wash hands and feet. And so that area was quite interesting. Of course, we could see the Dome of the Rock and the mosque opposite it, but we were not permitted to go into those areas. And there were many Muslims in the area. And so we walked around to various sides of the Temple Mount, and Joe lectured us about this and that while we were there. And then I would say we stayed maybe 45 minutes or so, and Joe was very conscious of the time, because he said if we overstay our time, they're going to come and ask us to leave. So we had to be very cautious. And when Joe told us to stay away from a certain area, to stay far away, not to push the boundaries, we made sure to do that, because none of us wanted to do anything that would cause us to be sent out of the area. But one of the things that was so touching to me was that essentially the Orthodox rabbis today believe that we should not go up to the Temple Mount because of the fact that it's now controlled by the Muslims. But we had a rabbi in our group who had never been up to the Temple Mount. This is one other than Joe. And you're not allowed to visibly pray on the Temple Mount. You can't take a prayer book up there. If you take your phone up there, you can make pictures. But if you're seen looking like you're reading prayers off of a phone or whatever, and some of the authorities see you up there doing that, they will ask you to leave. But it was just so touching that this rabbi, he's older, and he had never been on top of the Temple Mount. And you could see him praying, prayers he's known, that he's memorized from his youth. And it just so touched his heart to get to be there. That was just so special to me. So after we left the Temple Mount, we went to the Jewish quarter. Now, remember, the old city of Jerusalem is separated into certain areas. There's the Jewish quarter, there's what's known as the Christian quarter, there's the Armenian quarter, and there's the Muslim quarter. Okay, so for the most part, we stayed out of the Muslim quarter. We shopped and we interacted and spent a lot of time in the Jewish quarter. And some of us went into the Christian quarter. I'll tell you more about that in another broadcast. But we went to the Jewish quarter and we had lunch, and I shared a burger with a friend, Jay, and ate with her and her husband, Andrew. He had gotten some food from a local outdoor restaurant there. And there's a wonderful shop there. And I bought a head covering because there's so many occasions where you need to wear a head covering on this trip. And I alluded to this in a prior broadcast that I didn't have a head covering. I was unprepared, and I had borrowed one for the previous Shabbat. And so I decided to buy one because we were going to have Shabbat again soon. And it was going to be there in Jerusalem. And so I wanted to have my own head covering. And I bought one at the shop of this lovely lady named Esther. And Esther was one of the first people she and her husband allowed to open a shop there in the Jewish quarter after 1947, when actually, I misspoke. After 1967, when the Jews retook the city of Jerusalem, and they began to go into the old city and liberate the old city, and they opened shops there. And so Esther has a shop there. It's right next door to Shorashim. Shorashim and Esther's shop are, I think they're operated by the same members of the same family, but don't hold me to that. At any rate, Esther sells jewelry, and she sells artifacts, and she sells women's items. And she sells things like Shabbat candle holders and Havdalah candle holders, and things of that nature. So it's a beautiful little shop, and she is an amazing lady. I'm going to show you a picture of her at the end of the broadcast. But since Esther was such a pioneer, she and her husband, in 1967, she was honored with an Esther Day just not too long ago, just a very few years ago. She's in her 90s and still runs the shop, still very active. But at any rate, I bought a betrothal ring from Shorashim, from the shop next door. And that's this ring. I'm sorry, I don't have it on today. Oh my goodness, I should have worn it. Well, I'll show you a picture of it at the end of the broadcast. But I had a betrothal ring years ago that I had bought. And the reason that I bought this ring to wear on, and this is the one I wear when I wear gold. Okay, this is just a Pandora betrothal ring. Okay, but I wear it on the index finger of my right hand. And the reason that I do that is because in Jewish marital rights, the betrothal is as binding as the marriage, but the betrothal is an engagement period, and it's usually an extended engagement period. But the ring is not given at the wedding. The ring is given at the betrothal, and the Jewish bride would wear the betrothal ring on the index finger of her right hand. And so I had one, not this one. I had a silver one, and it was interlocking hearts all the way around the band. But I'd worn it so much that it had worn out. I mean, literally, it had gotten so worn on the back that it just broke, and it was irreparable. So I decided, okay, when I go to Israel, I'm going to get another silver toned betrothal ring. So I bought one there at Shorashim, and it has the chapter 6, verse 3 on it. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. And of course, the ring reminds me that as a member of the bride of Yeshua, I'm betrothed to him, and the life that I live to him is that's the betrothal period. And I live it preparing for my ultimate marriage to him when I see him face to face, panim el panim, in heaven. So the wedding will be after he returns to get all of his beloveds. And I look forward to that day. All the bride will be together. We'll have a marriage ceremony, a marriage supper called the Marriage Supper of the Lamb. And that's going to be a glorious day. So after lunch, we went to a museum that is called the Davidson Institute. And that's because it's sponsored by the Davidson family. And interestingly, here near where I live in North Georgia, we used to have a big shopping store called Davidson's. And later, I guess it was bought out and it began to be called Macy's. And it's called Macy's to this day. And even if you don't live in North Central Georgia, you may be familiar with the Macy's Day Parade. So Macy's is the latter day iteration of the Davidson department store. And I don't know if it's the same family or not, but it may be. At any rate, I have a picture that I want to show you from there of something called the foundation stone. And I'll tell you more about that when I show you that picture toward the end of the broadcast. So after we left this museum, which is located very close to the temple complex, we got to see another synagogue. Now, this one is called the Hurva Synagogue. That is spelled Hurv as in victory, A. All right, the Hurva Synagogue, and it's in the Jewish Quarter. It has a long and storied history of hardship, including multiple destructions and rebuildings. The current building is gorgeous, but it was only rebuilt 13 years ago. It's such a gorgeous place, and one of the features is in the top of the cupola that is on top of the building. There's a narrow catwalk around the interior perimeter of this cupola, and you can only reach it by going up they look like fire escape stairs, going up the outside of the cupola, and then you go in an exterior door, and then you can walk around inside the perimeter of the cupola. And of course, the dome, the inner dome itself is beautiful, but it's very large. And if you stand directly across from another person on that catwalk and you whisper, they can hear you 30 feet away. I mean, the acoustics are just astounding. So another interesting thing about that synagogue was that we went up into a balcony. Not being Jewish men, we weren't allowed on the main floor. Okay. So we went up into the women's balcony, and there was a docent there who spoke to us about the Hurva Synagogue. And while we were listening to her, I thought, my goodness, this young lady looks so much like my Aunt Bobby, who passed away back in the spring of 2021. I can't believe it's been over 2 years. Miss her dreadfully. I look a lot like her, for one thing, and she was just a fabulous lady. But at any rate, if you look at a young picture of my aunt and you look at that girl, they could be mother and daughter. What's interesting to me about that, and what struck me about that, is that this young lady, this Jewish young lady, is from Switzerland. Well, our family has, on my mother's side, has had this sort of legend that our ancestors were Jews from Switzerland. But when you look in the DNA, like ancestry DNA, that doesn't show up. Now, I've also done family tree DNA, and there's some very short Jewish threads in there. But the legend is that the Carpenters, my mother's maiden name, were formerly Zimmermans from Switzerland. And when they came through Ellis Island, their name was changed from Zimmerman to Carpenter. And if they were indeed Jews, they became Christianized over the generations. But at any rate, I guess I'm kind of moving back toward my roots, maybe family roots, maybe also, well, definitely also theological roots. But at any rate, I took a picture of this young lady and I sent it side by side with a picture of my aunt to my mother, and I was like, "What do you think about this resemblance?" And I told her the story. That was a fascinating part of the trip for me personally. So our next stop was this house called the Burnt House. And this is a home from the Second Temple period, which is the time that Yeshua lived, that Jesus lived. And it was situated in the opulent Herodian quarter of the upper city of Jerusalem. And recent excavations have revealed burnt wooden beams and other house components. Apparently, it burned down in the great fire that the Romans started in Jerusalem after the temple's destruction in 70 Common Era. An inscription on a stone weight that was found during the excavations indicates that this house apparently belonged to a family of high ranking temple priests mentioned in the Bible. This is believed to have been the home of Caiaphas. Yes, the infamous Caiaphas. And the palatial mansion next door, which was 6,000 square feet in size, is believed to be the home of Caiaphas's father-in-law, Annas, or as some translations say, Ananias. So that was really amazing. Now, Ananias was a contemporary of a very famous Jewish rabbi named Hillel the Elder. And Hillel the Elder taught during the latter half of the last century BCE, before Common Era, and during the first few years of the first century Common Era. He died in 10 Common Era, 10 AD, and he, it is said, had a profound influence on the theology of Jesus. In fact, if you compare the teachings of Hillel the Elder with the teachings of Jesus, you will see a tremendous amount of overlap. So, at any rate, Ananias had 5 sons and 1 son in law, Caiaphas. Both were instrumental in the illegal trial of Jesus and his resulting death penalty assignment by the crowd. Pincus was the last high priest. He was the high priest when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And Josephus, that famous Jewish historian, described Pincus as, quote, a clown, end quote. Pincus was Ananias's grandson. Now, that afternoon, after we visited the burnt house, we had a complication. Our ride home, the bus, became stuck in traffic, and it was delayed for an hour and a half picking us up. We went by a gate that I will show you a picture of a little later that is riddled with bullet holes, remnants from the 1967 war. And right outside that gate is a bus pickup area. And so we sat there and visited each other and compared notes and so on and so forth until the bus arrived. But after we got back to our hotel, we had dinner, and then we did some shopping or visiting or whatever else we wanted to do for the rest of the evening. So that was day 9. And I'm going to move on now to day 10 because I said I was going to try and do 2 days today. So we will see if I can make it all the way through day 10. All right. Before we do that, though, I think I'm going to show you some pictures from day 9. Okay. Now, this is a picture of the foundation stone. This was from the Israel Museum. I'm sorry, that's not right. Check. This was from the Davidson Institute, and it was down in the basement of that area. And we didn't have a lot of time to talk about this particular stone, but I invite you to search about it online. Just search for Israel's foundation stone. But this foundation stone that I showed you a picture of is there in the Davidson Institute, and it is believed to be a very ancient stone that was in the second period temple. So I'll leave it to you to look more and learn more about that. This is a picture. It's not a very good picture of me, but it's a picture of me getting my head wrap that I bought from Esther. And so that's a good picture of Esther there, if you can see her close up. Well, she really looks good for her age. She's an amazing lady. But she was showing me how to tie my head wrap. And here's the finished product. Okay, not a great picture, granted. Now, this is that wall I was telling you about. And if you look really closely, you can see it's pockmarked by bullet holes. You see how the surface is so rough? Well, those are bullet holes, people. I mean, this was the site of a war, okay? A war zone. The next picture I'm going to show you is called the Great Menorah. And I had seen pictures of this menorah in the past and wanted to go see it. But this is a huge menorah in the city of Jerusalem. And I don't know if I have anything else I can tell you about this menorah or not. I'm not really sure that I took any additional notes on this, but it weighs a lot and it's made of pure gold. And you can see from the picture that it's in this sort of, there's sort of a reflection on it. That is a plexiglass, or I don't know, I don't think it's plexiglass, but it's like plexiglass case that it's in. And it sort of stands out there in the open square. You can see that there are people at the base of it, and that sort of gives you an idea of the scale of this menorah. It is huge, okay? And 7 branches, of course. So that's the Great Menorah. All right, let's see what else I have here for you. All right, this is the inside the cupola of the Herva Synagogue. Do you see up there at the top? You see the black wrought iron fence. All right, that's where we were up there in the top of the cupola. And then down below, you can see the ark area of this beautiful synagogue. It is truly magnificent. Again, they only rebuilt it a few years ago. And this is the photo of the young lady from Switzerland who was our docent. Okay. And it's another photo of her. And I think that's all the photos I have for you right now from that part of the trip. So let me move on to day 10 then. Now, on day 10, again, we were in Jerusalem. Again, that is where we stayed for most of our time. And one of the things that we did on this day was we went to the southern wall of the temple. Now, in the southern wall of the temple, there are 3 gates, and these are called the triple gate. What a surprise, right? These are called the triple gate, and you had 3 gates together, like 3 arches like this, okay? And in one of those sections of the triple gate, animals were brought in. They were brought up an inclined ramp, walked up an inclined ramp at just the right incline, and then they were taken into a large room that was adjacent to that entrance, and they were kept apart from the people until it was time for their sacrifice. Now, beside this ramp, there were many steps leading up to the other 2 openings of the triple gate, and these steps were more narrow because this was the entrance where the Levites and the priests entered. The common people did not enter there. At the triple gate, only the priests and the animals entered there. And then if you moved on down to the western end of the southern wall, there was a double gate, and the steps leading up to the double gate were much broader because this was the main entrance into the temple for the common people. And at the base of that southern wall, there were shops, and there were also shops at the base of the western wall. And so we got some teaching there at that location. So much excellent teaching on this trip. If you are messianic and you really want to delve into the minutia of the temple period and the old city of Jerusalem, and so forth, I would highly recommend you go with Joe Good or with Jennifer Cash on one of their upcoming temple and Holy Land tours. They're not surface area tours. I mean, you study before you go, and then you study while you're there. Okay. It is a study tour. Okay. So from there, we went on a tour into the Western tunnels. Now, again, this is not a tour that is open to all people. It is a restricted tour, and not everyone can take it. But we went below the street level, adjacent to the western wall. And on the western wall of the temple complex, in ancient days, there was a long ramp which extended from the western wall all the way across the Tyropean Valley. Some people pronounce it Tyropean. It just depends. But the Tyropean Valley was the most eastern of the three valleys that have cradled Jerusalem for millennia. And beneath the ramp were a series of 17 vaults and arches, which supported the weight of that bridge. And the foundations of the bridge were laid on the ruins of structures from the Second Temple period. The 17 openings or vaults are visible in recreations of the southern facade of the bridge, which connected the Temple Mount with the upper city, which was the Jewish quarter of that day. The level of the bridge was at the same height as the level of the Temple Mount. And the Tyropean Bridge was first built during the Second Temple period, sometime between 20 BCE and 20 CE. So it's very possible that Yeshua saw this bridge being built. The width of the bridge, though, was doubled in 30 CE. So Yeshua would certainly have seen this doubling of the size of the bridge. The bridge also functioned as an aqueduct to bring water for the needs of the temple into the temple complex, as well as a direct pedestrian approach from the upper city to the Temple Mount. Now, who lived in the upper city? Most of the priests and the Levites lived in the upper city, unless you were just very well connected, like Caiaphas's family, in which case you lived in the Herodian quarter of the Temple Mount area. Now, this water system was still functioning when the British conquered the land during World War I. And although the bridge was broken in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, it was later restored, apparently in the 2nd century, when Jerusalem was made into a pagan city called Aelia Capitolina by the Romans. Now, built into this wall at the bottom, and I know you're thinking, wait a minute, were we going to take a tour of the Western Wall tunnels? Yes, but you need this background to understand it. Okay, so stick with me. All right, built into this wall, this walkway that went across the valley. Near the wall, under the walkway, was a large building where the witnesses came each month to assist the high priest and the Sanhedrin in declaring the new moon. This was done every single month. And that was just one of its uses. It was a very opulent building, which included a very open area and what looks to have been some sort of gymnasium. Now, I don't have time today, or at least I don't think I do, to explain to you the process that these witnesses went through when they declared the new moon. But if I have time, I'll revisit that because I think I talked about it just a little bit when we were on that lookout point a few broadcasts ago where they would look for the new moon. Okay, so at any rate, this has been called over the centuries the Herodian building, the Hasmonean building, or the Freemasons building. The building was lavishly decorated with many pilasters. Now, what in the world is that? Mishkan, Katan. What is that, Gina? Well, a pilaster was an ornate column that was built into a wall. So it wasn't a freestanding column that you could walk around or look around on all four surfaces of the circumference. No, it was built into the wall. It was part of the wall. And if you go to my Resplendent Daughter Ministries Facebook page, you can see a picture or one or more of a pilaster. Now, some of these pilasters were water fountains. Water would cascade down from the top of the pilaster through an opening and would rush down the column to a trough at the bottom. And they showed us during this Western Wall Tunnels tour, they projected a hologram onto some of the pilasters, and it was a representation, therefore, of what it would have been like to see these pilasters in their glory before their destruction. And it was very beautiful. Now, other possible uses of this building was as the counting hall of Jerusalem or one of the council chambers of the Sanhedrin. Now, originally, the Sanhedrin met in one of the four corner towers of the temple proper. But after the death of Yeshua, sometime around 40 CE, they moved their meeting location to an alternate spot. And this is believed to be by some the new location. Now, also on the tunnels tour, we saw one of the 170 ancient mikvot that have been excavated in the temple area. And this one that we saw was destroyed by the British archaeologist Charles Warren during his excavations. Charles Warren was a great man and a great friend of Israel, and we owe very much to Charles Warren. It's just a shame that in using his dynamite to blow a hole into the ground, he did significant damage to this mikveh. This particular mikveh was not very deep. It's theorized that it was most likely used to purify the dishes and basins that were used for holy purposes in the temple. We also saw a very small Roman theater, and this theater was built after the destruction of the temple, built by the Romans. And we also saw a great model of the temple complex overall, which I understand much better after having been on this trip. And we saw another newly discovered section of the Western Wall. And when I say newly discovered, this section was only opened up to the Western Wall tour in the past year or two. So many of the people who've been to Israel many times who were on our tour had never seen it. And of course, we walked over there and we prayed at that wall. So this was underground. Again, we were in tunnels. But this particular section of the Western Wall is underneath the men's section on the outdoor plaza. And this underground section was hid for 1,700 years. And we were privileged on this tour to stand before that section of wall. And in this section, visitors have placed notes, prayers, much as they do on the upper section that's open to a much broader population on the plaza. Now, yesterday we were sort of in a rush, and we didn't have an opportunity to finish our exploration of the Davidson Museum. And so this gave us another opportunity to come back and finish our tour near the southern steps of the temple. And these are the same steps I mentioned a few moments ago. But when we first looked at them at the beginning of the day, we were pretty far away. And looking at them on this revisit, we got to see them more close up. But on the way to see them more close up, we saw a wall of the Acre fortress. Now, this fortress was built by the Seleucids, and it played a significant role in the Maccabean revolt of 166 BCE. This was the revolt that produced the Hasmonean dynasty, and the Hasmonean dynasty is the dynasty of the Herods. Herod Antipas, Herod the Great, and so on. Goodness, though, it was so hot up there on those steps. I had to be dressed modestly in long pants and a shirt that reached my elbows, and I just got very overheated. And when we returned from that area, I had to sit and drink a significant amount of water. But one of the artifacts that we saw on the top of the southwest corner of the temple was the house, on the southwestern corner, was where the house of the trumpeting was located. And these tops of the walls had fallen down when the temple had been destroyed in 70 CE. They had fallen, the towers at the four corners of the temple were very, very tall, several stories high. And the temple itself was 22 stories high. So they had fallen from these corner towers. They had fallen down to the ground. And we got to see those particular tops of those towers. And I have a picture of that. But at any rate, this place is described in the Oral Torah, the Mishnah, in Tractate Sulka, as the location where the temple crier would stand to announce the opening and the close of the Shabbat with the blast of the shofar. And it's possible that this is where the temple crier stood to announce the dawn, the time for the morning prayers, and the time for the midday prayers, and the time for the evening prayers. And the nickname for the temple crier who did this was the cock. And, of course, in English, cock is a nickname for a rooster. And you can see how in English, when the translators were translating this word, they did not understand that this was a Jewish euphemism for the temple crier. So in the New Testament, when you hear a reference to how the cock crowed 3 times, it was not a rooster. People, roosters were not allowed inside the temple complex. They weren't even allowed in the city, the inner city. That's because these animals, although not unclean in the Torah sense of clean versus unclean, they were just considered to be generally nasty animals, and you never sacrificed a chicken on the altar. So there was no reason for chickens to be in this part of town, shall we say. So it wouldn't have been a rooster that crowed 3 times. It was the temple crier from a tower, perhaps this one. All right, so moving on. In addition to the Southern Steps tour, we really didn't have time to have a decent lunch, but that was okay. We'd rather have seen what we saw than eat anyway. So we grabbed something quick at a coffee shop, and at 2 o'clock, we had a scheduled tour in what's known as the City of David, which is the name for the royal palace complex that lies just below the Temple Mount. I mean, you can walk from one to the other in 10 minutes, but the Temple Mount is at a significantly higher elevation. Now, before King David came on the scene, the area of Jerusalem, this area of Jerusalem, was inhabited and controlled by an ancient people called the Jebusites. And the Jebusites were one of the 70 nations mentioned in the table of nations that you can find in Genesis 10. So they've been around a while, okay? But they began to control this area in about the 8th century BCE. And then Canaan was under the control of the Egyptian Empire. And things were all hunky dory until the Jebusites, who were vassals of Egypt, began building a city on Mount Moriah. And so the Jebusites were doing this, and the Egyptians threatened to destroy the city because they didn't like this. The Jebusites began building their city on Mount Moriah. And so the Egyptians sent representatives to Jerusalem. They actually sent their gods to Jerusalem. Well, how did they do this, you may ask? Well, the Egyptians wrote more than 200 curses against the Jebusites, rulers of Jerusalem, and they sent them by their messengers to Jerusalem. And this fear and intimidation tactic kept the Jebusites and their capital city of Jebus loyal to Egypt. It was rather unorthodox, but it was effective. The Jebusites were pretty superstitious, I guess. And so this kept on through the period of the judges in the Bible until King David defeated the Jebusites in the 700s BCE. See, oddly enough, when the Hebrew people came into Canaan to conquer the land, Jerusalem was not made the immediate capital city. No, it was not. And instead, the capital city, the Hebrews were first headquartered at Shechem, and then at Shiloh, and then at Hebron. It was not until David became king that he moved the center of power to Jerusalem. And that was not until he had reigned for more than 10 years away from Jerusalem. A lot of people don't know that fact. Well, at first, archaeologists thought that the city of David, that is, David's palace and governmental center, they thought that that particular complex was inside the walls of the old city. These city walls were built by a person named Suleiman the Magnificent. And this took place in the 1400s Common Era. He was the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. And he was the same dude who blocked up the Eastern Gate, a double gate of the old city, so that the Messiah could not come through it when he arrives. Because even the Muslims knew the Jewish scriptures, and they knew that the Jewish scriptures predict that Messiah will come through the Eastern Gate, as if Suleiman blocking it up could stop Messiah when he returns to earth again the second time, this time in triumph and glory as the conquering king. And this Messiah is the one and only true Messiah, and his name is Yeshua, by the way. Incidentally, many of my readers may know that Herod the Great in the last century BCE greatly expanded the temple complex. He only expanded it on the north side, the south side, and the western side. He did not expand it on the eastern side at all. And one of the reasons is because that valley that I was talking about, the Kidron Valley, is on the eastern side of the temple complex. So, well, anyway, let me get back on track. In the second half of the 19th century, archaeologists began to discover that the city of David was not inside the city walls that Suleiman had erected. And that day, there was a neighborhood built on top of the ancient city of David. And there still is to some extent. In fact, they're still excavating it today, but it's difficult because there are homes there. It's seriously a neighborhood. Right up against the city of David is the Kidron Valley. It's the easternmost of the three valleys that run through the hills. The Tyropian, I misspoke earlier, the Tyropian is the middle valley that used to run up through the old city. It is now pretty much been built over. But in ancient days, it was the middle valley that ran up through the city of Jerusalem. So one of the first stops on our City of David tour is an excavated pile of ruins called the Large Stone Structure. And some believe it was maybe the remnants of David's palace, but that can't be conclusively proven. So they just call it the Large Stone Structure to hedge their bets. But the structure is 100 feet east to west by 75 feet north to south. And that is huge by the standard size of houses of that day. It is certainly the size of a palace. And by the style of the artifacts, archaeologists have determined that this house was built, are you ready for this? 3,000 years ago. So I may have gotten to stand in David's ancient palace. Well, we went on around the bend of the city of David and we analyzed the ruins of what appears to be an administrative building, which would make sense because David's offices would surely be near his home, right? And in Jeremiah 36, the prophet says that the administrative offices were southeast of the Temple Mount. And after that was the tour of Hezekiah's tunnels. Now, I really should have gone on that tour, but honestly, I had been overcome with extreme heat earlier, and I did not think I could face 2 hours underground. I know I should be ashamed of myself. I wanted the information and the learning, but we were told that we were going to be in very confined quarters, bending over while walking, traipsing through water. And I just simply couldn't. Okay. That was the end of the official day, though. And so I went back to my room and rested. And then that night, the weather was so beautifully nice and cool. The weather in Jerusalem is just so varied. You can have a very cool night where you need a sweater, and the next day it can be well up into the 90s. But it's a dry heat. And basically and overall, the weather was okay, even though we were in Jerusalem area in the middle of the summer. So that was the end of day 10. And I promised you some pictures before I go. So I'm going to grab my glasses over here and see if I can't find some to show you right quick and comment on for you. Let's see what we have here. This is a little video I'm going to play for you. It's very short, but we came upon this group of people that was dancing outside, right outside the temple complex. So I want to play this for you really quickly. Let me see if it wasn't that cool? You should have seen it in person. It was even more cool. And so I'm looking for some more photos for you. Now, this is a photo from the Temple Mount. I believe this was on the, well, I'm not going to say because I can't be sure. But this is one of the many opulent sets of steps leading up to an area which we could not go. We were not allowed to stand on these steps. But these are just some beautiful pictures. And I want you to look at those three arches there. That is, sorry, people are texting me. That is very similar to what the triple gate, what its architectural design looked like on the southern wall that I was telling you about earlier, even though that was on the Temple Mount. This is a beautiful tree-lined walkway on the Temple Mount. Like I said, the trees are there today, but they weren't in ancient days. This is a remnant of a wall where the Sanhedrin met in later years after 40 CE. This is a picture of one of the mosques on the Temple Mount. This is the famous gold-domed Dome of the Rock. Remember me telling you about how Joe discovered some ancient toilets? They're underneath this structure that you see there. The ruins are there. We didn't go down there. I'm glad, but that's just neither here nor there. This is an ancient courtyard up there on top of the Temple Mount. This is that fountain that I was referring to earlier. You see the little seats all around the fountain where people could wash their feet and their hands. Very beautiful. This is a photo of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque sits directly across from the Dome of the Rock. And again, we were not allowed to approach it. These are olives. Let me see if I can make them a little larger so you can see a little better. No, I take that back. These are not olives. These are limes that were growing in the area. All right, this is a photo not far from where we entered the complex to take us down into the tunnels. This is what's called the Kotel, the Western Wall, and you're looking at the men's section directly in front of you. This is a photo of the women's section. And unlike the men's section, there were chairs in the women's section. And you can see some women would sit and pray, and others would stand. There's a lady there in the black and white striped top who's standing and praying. And then still others would stand at the wall. They would read from their prayer books. And it was just very moving, very moving. And those are all the photos that I have for you today. Oh, I did want to show you this. This was the sweetest thing. And we'll end with this one. All right. But these are some little boys who were undergoing a ceremony. And you see they have on crowns and finery. And you can see they have on their little talit. See their, not their talit, their zitzit hanging off of their talit. Underneath their shirts. You see those there? Those for those of you who are not familiar, those little strands there. There's one knot in the talit for each of the 613 commandments. At any rate, these little boys were receiving their first copy of the Torah. And so this is a big occasion for them. Okay, peeps, I've got to run. I hope you enjoyed day 9 and day 10, but I've got to get out of here, and I've got to say I will see you next week back here on Mishkan, Katan.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.